Okie dokie, welcome back everyone to another day of science class. We are wrapping up our unit on behavioral adaptations this week. And yesterday we talked about migration. And today we are going to focus on a behavioral adaptation called hibernation. I bet you already have an idea what hibernation is. In other words, hibernation is survival sleep. So let's break it down and make sure we're on the same page. What is hibernation? Simply means sleeping or going dormant for a season or for a long period of time. And it's a behavioral adaptation to deal with cold environments. So this word dormant is an important word in science. We talk about both living and non-living things going dormant, which just means inactive. So this can be for weeks or sometimes months, sometimes many months, up to 8 or 9 months out of the year, where an animal will be sleeping and basically inactive. That doesn't mean they're completely unconscious all of the time, but it means that their body processes are slowing way down. So let's talk about what happens to an animal's body during hibernation. First thing that happens is the animal's energy decreases. So their temperature, their body temperature goes down, their heart rate slows down, their breathing slows down. So all of their body processes that are keeping them alive are starting to slow and relax, including their metabolism, which basically is the drive for hunger and your body burning fuel and burning energy and burning up, calories and fat in your body. And that's where your metabolism comes from. And that whole process slows down too, so the animals don't get as hungry and their body's not burning up a lot of energy. And of course, for this time, the animals are seeking shelter. So they're usually in a den or in a nest or a hole in a tree where they can be safe while their body is resting and relaxing. So this is a really incredible adaptation. Sometimes I wish humans had this adaptation, because I would love to sleep for months at a time. But this is an incredible adaptation that wild animals use, usually to escape the cold winter. So not only does it protect them from the cold, but it also helps them survive in a time period where there's not a whole lot of food. Sometimes in certain biomes, in certain habitats, during the winter, that means there's less sunlight and therefore there are fewer plants growing, and that interrupts the whole food chain and means that there are a lot less plants and animals to eat. So instead of struggling to survive in this time, struggling to stay warm and struggling to find food, instead these creatures over a long time have adapted to be able to just rest during that time and basically tone down or shut down the needs of their body so that they can survive and just basically wait it out until there's better conditions, warmer weather, and more food. So it's a really genius solution that nature and wild animals have evolved to survive in tough conditions. So how does an animal prepare for this long survival sleep? There's 2 main tasks that an animal has to do, and this usually starts months before it's time to hibernate. So basically, as soon as an animal wakes up out of its sleep, it's getting ready for the next hibernation season. So the main important parts are packing on the pounds. So just like when an animal is getting ready to migrate, same thing. Long journey requires lots of energy, and a long sleep also requires lots of energy and lots of fat on the animal's body, because they're not going to be able to get up and hunt and eat food while they're hibernating. There are some animals who are able to store food for the winter, but not every animal that hibernates stores food. You know, some animals like squirrels, for example, will hide nuts to be able to go back to them during times of when it's difficult to find food. But a lot of animals don't do that. So instead they store their food on their body and they get really chunky and really fat, just like they do before they go on a long migration. And that way their fat can sustain them during these months that they are sleeping and resting. And then, of course, the second half of preparation is making sure your den or your nest is ready to go. So animals have to secure their shelter. Sometimes that means building a nest or building a den, and sometimes that just means, you know, making sure it is big enough and comfortable enough and protected from the elements. So these are the two main objectives of wild animals. Before they hibernate, they have to make sure they have enough stored fat on their body or in their shelter, and they have to make sure that they have a shelter and somewhere safe to rest for the winter. So let's recap, why do animals hibernate? The main reason is to deal with cold temperatures during the winter, and also to deal with a lack of food during the winter. So both herbivores and carnivores and omnivores too deal with this lack of food during the winter. If there are fewer plants, then there are fewer animals who eat the plants, and then there are even fewer animals who eat animals. So the whole food chain is affected when plants start dying in the winter. And basically, hibernation is just a behavioral adaptation that allows animals to survive the challenges of their environment. Awesome. So let's pause our video. Let's answer question number 1. Tell me, what is the purpose of hibernation? You can go to your Google form, or if you want to write it on a separate piece of paper while you're watching, that works as well. Alrighty, so let's talk about a few different types of hibernation. There are 3 special versions of hibernation that just look a little bit different. So let's talk about these 3 things. Estivation. You can almost imagine that there's no A and just pronounce it with the EST sound, estivation. I've even seen this word spelled without the A before, but many times it's spelled with the A, so that's how we're going to spell it today. But you just pronounce it estivation. We'll talk about what that means in a second. We're also going to talk about denning and torpor. So these are 3 good vocabulary words that describe different types of hibernation. First of all, let's talk about estivation. Estivation is basically hibernation, but with hot temperatures instead of cold temperatures. So instead of sleeping through the winter, we can think of estivation as the summer sleep. So this is what we call hibernation for animals who, for example, in the desert, sleep through the hottest part of the summer. We don't call it hibernation, we call it estivation, because hibernation is sleeping through the winter and trying to avoid the cold. So this is like a type of hibernation. And we will see some amphibians and a lot of desert dwellers like snakes and tortoises who will do this, who will use estivation to help them survive the summer. Now, what about denning? Denning has that word den in it. So you should think of a den and maybe a mama bear and her cubs in a den. So denning is basically the light version of hibernation. So it's a survival sleep where the animal is sleeping through the winter, but instead of being really fast asleep, denning is where the animal is still easily awoken. So they can still wake up at certain sounds or light or movement. Whereas an animal who's in true hibernation might have a harder time waking up. You have to really have some kind of huge stimulus to rouse them from their sleep. So denning is something that happens to some bears, especially mama bears. So think about a mama bear who has young cubs, cubs who are only a year old or less than a year old. As they are hibernating, as they're spending their first year in hibernation, we would call it denning, because that mama bear is still fairly active. So her body processes are going to slow down. Her heart rate will slow down, her breathing will slow down, but she's still pretty easy to wake compared to other hibernators. So this makes sense, right? Because she has young cubs to take care of, and so she needs to be able to be awoken and get up quickly if something goes wrong with them or if they're crying out for her, and just to keep them protected. So I'm sure new moms can relate to this. When you have young babies, you are a light sleeper. I've heard. I don't have young babies, but so they say. Okay, and then let's talk about torpor. Torpor is our final kind of hibernation that we're going to talk about today. And it's basically a temporary hibernation. So that means it usually only lasts for one day or a few days compared to a few months or a few weeks. So this is a technique or an adaptation that some animals use to survive brief, difficult periods. So think about like a cold snap or a blizzard or a winter storm that would blow through. Some animals can go into torpor, which is basically it's like hibernation where their body kind of shuts down, their heart rate decreases, their breathing decreases, and their body, all their energy decreases. So they're just in a restful state so that they can conserve their warmth and energy. But after the blizzard passes or after a few days, and it starts to warm up again, the animal can come out of their torpor and get back to activity in daily life. So this is just a brief hibernation, just a day or two of shutting the body down to protect it and to conserve energy during a small, short, difficult period. So that's torpor. Okay, so let's review these three special types of hibernation. We have regular hibernation is just sleeping through the winter to protect from the cold. Estivation is the summer version of hibernation. So animals who are sleeping through a hot season rather than a cold season. Denning is the light version of hibernation. So this is something that new moms really understand. It's something that happens to some bears. That's basically hibernation, but it's easier to wake you up than usual. So you're a little bit more conscious and a little bit more active than typical hibernation. And then finally we have torpor, which is the quick version of hibernation. And this word torpor reminds me of the word torpedo. In fact, I think they have the same root, torpedo sleep. So it's the quick sleep, just like a torpedo is super quick and fast and sleek through the water. Torpor is the same thing. It's a super quick and fast hibernation. It only lasts a day or so. Okay, so we've got estivation, the summer sleep, denning, the light sleep, And then torpor, the torpedo sleep or the quick sleep. Fantastic. All right, let's pause our video and answer question number 2. What's the difference between hibernation and estivation? What is the main difference? All right, and when you're ready, you press play, and hopefully you told me that hibernation is an adaptation to survive the cold or the winter, and estivation is an adaptation to survive the hot or the summer. Excellent. Okay, let's talk about just a few specific examples of animals and their sweet hibernation adaptations. First things first, we'll talk about one of my favorite creatures on Earth, the snail. Snail has a lot of really cool adaptations. Did you know that snails hibernate? They can hibernate through several months throughout the winter. And one thing that's cool about their hibernation is that they can seal up the bottom of their shell with this thin layer of slime or mucus. So when they're hibernating, they basically lock themselves in, seal themselves in, like putting a tarp or a coat over their shell or shutting the door. And that way they can stay safe for months at a time while they're hibernating through the coldest part of the winter. The interesting thing about snails is that they also sometimes estivate. So they will, in 1 year, they might hibernate in the winter and then also estivate during the summer. So they can go into a survival sleep multiple times during the year. Here's an insect who hibernates. These are ladybugs, and usually when ladybugs are hibernating, you will see them in huge crowds like this. So this is a safety feature. They're going to gather in huge groups while they're hibernating so that they can stay safe. So sometimes thousands of ladybugs will gather together, and you'll see them huddled in usually safe places. So they look for protected places where they can all group together and sleep through the winter. So under logs or under rocks, sometimes even inside your house or inside your basement. I've seen them gather inside of agave plants or deep inside of tall grasses or tall plants. So they find some kind of protected place where they can all come together. And that is a great adaptation. Not only do they hibernate, but then they also are grouping to help keep them safe. What about this furry rodent? Remember we talked about marmots when we learned about the alpine tundra. Marmots are some of my favorite animals. They are so mischievous. These critters live high up in the alpine, so that means they go through really harsh, cold winters. They're up at the tops of mountains. So they can hibernate for most of the year, up to 8 months out of the 12 months of the year. And that makes sense because the conditions are really harsh for a lot of the year. Even in the summertime at the tops of mountains, there can be really bad storms. So these animals will stay protected for most of the year until it starts to get a little bit warmer and a little bit nicer and more food starts to grow. So during the summer season, marmots are extremely active. That's when they do all of their mating and reproducing, and they find all of their food and store food and get really chunky and fat. And that's also the season where they are constructing their deep burrows. So one excellent skill of the marmot is they are able to burrow deep underground, sometimes 5, 6, 7 feet underground in the alpine, so that they have a nice protected place to stay warm and safe while they are sleeping through the winter. And in these deep burrows, they also huddle together. So you might find a whole family of marmots, or 6 or 7 marmots all in one burrow, all huddled together, and that's so that they can stay warm. All right, how about this strange animal? This is a fat-tailed lemur. They are monkeys who live in Madagascar, and check out this tail. This chunky tail is full of fat, and that adaptation actually helps them while they are hibernating. So these lemurs will hibernate sometimes for many months throughout a year. Whenever their preferred food, they usually eat fruit off of trees, and when that fruit is not growing, they will hibernate. So they'll find a hole in a tree, and while they're hibernating, what they live on is this store of fat in their tail. So during their active seasons, when the fruit is growing on the trees, they'll eat a ton of fruit, and their tails will get super big and chunky and fat. And then while they hibernate throughout the winter, their tails shrink up a little bit because the lemur is using that fat to sustain themselves. All right, let's talk about another insect who hibernates. Did you know that bumblebees hibernate? Well, in truth, it's a little bit sad, but most bumblebees will die before the winter. So really, the only one who's hibernating is the queen. Not all bees hibernate, but some species of bees, including bumblebees, will hibernate. So the queen will survive the winter and find a place to stay warm and safe for the winter. But most of her colony doesn't live through the winter. Most of the colony will die in the cold. So the queen on her own has to find a safe hole or a safe spot to hibernate for the winter, sometimes for months at a time. And then when it's time, she'll come back out and she will have to lay more eggs and start a new colony. All right, and last but not least, let's talk about an amphibian who hibernates. This is a wood frog, and wood frogs actually have an incredible ability. They basically almost are able to completely go dead and then revive themselves. While they're hibernating, their heartbeat completely stops, and they also stop breathing. So one might think that this frog is completely dead. And a huge percentage of its body, in fact, the majority of its body, can actually freeze. The little water molecules in its body can actually freeze and turn solid while it's hibernating. And then, like a miracle, once it's summer and it starts warming up again, or even in the springtime, the little wood frog will just de-thaw, and its heart starts beating again, and it starts breathing again, and it just gets back to action and starts living its little frog life once again. So pretty incredible ability and adaptation of this frog to be able to just completely shut down. I mean, most animals, their hearts and their breathing will slow down a lot, but it doesn't completely stop. So for this little frog, it's basically able to just freeze like a statue and then unfreeze again when it's time to be active. So I love that. I think that's fascinating. Alrighty, so pause your video. Let's answer the third and final question on your Google form. Question number 3, describe an animal who hibernates in an unexpected way. What animal hibernation adaptation surprised you? Alrighty, so I hope you learned something about hibernation today and got just a little taste of all the different types of creatures who hibernate and all the different ways that animals hibernate. It's not just sleeping through the winter. Sometimes it's sleeping through the summer or sleeping for just a few days. But animals all over the animal kingdom have learned how to adapt in this way, how to turn off the needs of their body or shut down their body's needs for a small amount of time, just so that they can survive a tough period a little bit easier. So I think this is amazing that nature can do this. And, you know, sometimes it would be cool if humans could do the same thing, right? But we're not able to shut off the needs of our body. We can only sleep for one night at a time. I don't know any human who's been able to hibernate. It's not our adaptation. But there's lots of animals who do, like this bear and these bees. Even animals like this turtle and different kinds of frogs. Lots of rodents hibernate, like groundhogs and squirrels and these skunks. And we even have some creatures who estivate or sleep during the summer, like this newt and this snail and even this garter snake. And then sometimes we have animals who can go into torpor or sleep for just a day or so to survive a cold snap, like this bat, for example, and this little hummingbird. So there's such a wide variety of abilities in the animal kingdom, but hopefully you have a good understanding of what is hibernation and how animals use it to survive in their environment. All right, that brings us to the end of our lesson today. You are ready to go and take your DOL. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.